In 1885, Tombstone was already awake before sunrise on the 4th of July. Cowboys fired their guns into the air as an alarm clock for the entire town. What happened on this day in the Old West was so different from what Hollywood shows that you won't believe it. Many of these facts were deliberately forgotten. Here are 25 things no one ever told you about how the West really celebrated the 4th of July. Number 1. Most cowboys didn't get the 4th of July off. You've probably seen that classic scene. Cowboys firing their pistols into the air, celebrating Independence Day in an Old West town. It looks great in the movies, but reality was very different. The vast majority of cowboys spent the 4th of July doing exactly the same thing they did the other 364 days of the year, taking care of cattle. Cattle drives, those long journeys moving thousands of head of cattle for hundreds of miles, did not stop for a holiday. The cattle needed water and pasture every single day, no matter what date was on the calendar. The trail boss, the man in charge of the drive, rarely gave the men time off. Some ranch owners gave them half a day off when the work was close to home, but that was the exception. The cowboys who actually celebrated were the few who happened to be in towns like Dodge City or Abilene that day. Hollywood took those rare cases, filmed them with fireworks and gunshots, and convinced everyone that was the norm. Number 2. Old West rodeos. Had no rules and killed competitors. You've seen a modern rodeo with judges, scoring, and safety gear. Now forget all of that. During 4th of July celebrations in the 19th century, a rodeo was basically a life-or-death gamble with no official structure whatsoever. There were no written rules. There were no judges. The crowd decided who won by shouting. A cowboy would ride a wild Mustang, and the only measure was how long he could hold on before being thrown to the ground. No one timed anything accurately. In steer roping contests, spectators estimated the time by consensus. Bull riders entered the arena with no vest, no helmet, nothing. When someone broke bones or got trampled, the crowd treated it as part of the show. And when someone died, because it happened and was documented, the event did not stop. On the contrary, the crowd got even more excited. The death of a competitor was not a tragedy. It was the highlight of the afternoon. Number 3. Baseball already dominated the Old West on the 4th of July. You probably picture the Old West on July 4th with shootouts and rodeos. But the main event was something else. Baseball. That's right. Towns like Deadwood, South Dakota, already had organized leagues in the 1870s. Dodge City, Kansas, put together competitive teams that challenged neighboring towns. And those rivalry games were scheduled specifically for the 4th of July for one practical reason. It was the only day of the year when cowboys, miners, and farmers all stopped working at the same time and went into town. That was the only way to fill the makeshift wooden bleachers they set up in open fields. And there was more. Heavy betting went on at those games. We're talking about real money changing hands, which made every game as tense as any saloon showdown. Baseball spread west so quickly that in some of those frontier towns, the sport arrived before they even had a courthouse or a church. While the East was debating official rules, the West was already playing the game their own way. Number 4. In 1878, Dodge City was considered one of the most violent towns in the American West. And do you know what the worst day of the year was? The 4th of July. Every time the holiday came around, cowboys got drunk on whiskey, pulled out their revolvers, and the celebration turned into a shootout. After repeated bloodbaths, the authorities made a decision that surprises a lot of people today. They banned guns within city limits. The rule was simple. Any cowboy crossing into town had to turn in his revolver at the sheriff's office or at the hotel. Anyone caught carrying a weapon was fined or sent to jail. Wyatt Earp and Bat Masterson were put in charge of enforcing the law. And it worked. Gun deaths dropped considerably in the years that followed. Now think about that situation. The town that became a symbol of the Wild West had to disarm its citizens on the very holiday that celebrates American freedom. Sometimes history itself delivers contradictions no one could make up. Number 5. 90-minute political speeches were the main entertainment. These days, no one can stand listening to a politician talk for more than 10 minutes. But in Old West towns, the situation was completely different. On the 4th of July, the political speech was the main event of the afternoon, and there was nothing else competing for people's attention. With no daily newspapers, no radio, and no other form of entertainment available, the public simply went to the town square and stayed there. Judges, local politicians, and prominent figures stepped onto a makeshift stage and spoke for 45 to 90 minutes straight. And the detail that changes everything is that the audience drank the entire time. In Deadwood, records from 1877 show speeches starting around 2 in the afternoon and dragging on until dark, with the crowd getting more and more drunk while listening to debates about the Republic and the Constitution. To give you an idea of the difference, a typical 4th of July speech in 1880 lasted about 4 times longer than any political address broadcast on modern television. It was a mix of a political rally, theater, and happy hour that simply does not exist anymore. Number 6. 4th of July. Whiskey was often deadly. Here is a fact few people know. The whiskey served in frontier towns was not exactly whiskey. Distillers mixed in tobacco to darken the color, red pepper to create that burning sensation in the throat, and in the worst cases, substances like copper sulfate and even lead acetate to make the drink stronger. The term rot gut, which everyone knows, was not just an expression. It was a real description of what that liquid did to the stomach of anyone who drank it. Medical records from Dodge City in 1898 documented 3 deaths from alcohol poisoning on a single 4th of July. 3 people went out to celebrate and never made it home. The problem was simple. Real whiskey, distilled in the East, was expensive and almost never reached the smaller towns in the West, so the saloons sold whatever they had. By today's food safety standards, there would be no question that it was pure poison. Number 7. Saloon owners waited all year for one single day. If you have ever worked in retail, you know what the Black Friday rush is like. Now, imagine that in an Old West saloon, with no air conditioning, no cash register, and everyone carrying a gun. Surviving account books from saloons in Deadwood, South Dakota, reveal a pattern that repeated every year. July 4th was by far the biggest sales day on the calendar. Some owners recorded revenue on that single date, equal to the previous 3 months combined. Preparation started weeks in advance. Owners hired temporary bartenders, stocked extra barrels of whiskey, and raised their prices. Even then, many ran out of alcohol before noon. The profit margin per bottle could be 3 times higher than on a normal day, and no one complained. Miners, cowboys, and soldiers spent everything they had in their pockets. The 4th of July was to a frontier saloon what Christmas is to retail today. The difference was that there were no credit cards and no return policies. Number 8. Cowboys spent an entire month's pay on the holiday. In the 880s, a typical cowboy earned somewhere between $25 and $30 a month. That sounds like very little, and it really was. That money covered the basics and barely left anything for extras. Now imagine that guy arriving in town on the 4th of July. Drinks cost more because of the holiday. There was betting on horse races, shooting competitions with entry fees, and card games in the saloons. The cowboy spent months isolated. working out on the range. And when he finally reached civilization on a day of celebration, he wanted to enjoy everything at once. The result was predictable. Many left town without a single cent in their pockets, and some still owed money to the saloon owner. Ranch owners already knew this was going to happen. That is why they advanced their workers' pay before the holiday, acting almost like an informal bank to keep them from coming back in debt. August was known as the hardest month for a cowboy. The financial hangover from the 4th of July lasted for weeks. Number 9. Gambling was allowed for one day, and the sheriff got a cut. Here is something no one tells you in school textbooks. In several Old West towns, the 4th of July worked like an unofficial holiday from the law itself. Gambling, which was technically banned or regulated, operated freely in the streets and saloons without anyone being arrested for it. Card tables, dice games, and every kind of betting appeared on every corner. But it was not uncontrolled chaos. There was an unspoken agreement. The town sheriff received a percentage of the gambling house's profits as a kind of unofficial holiday fee. Was it a bribe? Technically, yes. But the system was so common that it became almost standard in frontier towns. Pat Garrett, the man who killed Billy the Kid, described this arrangement in his own book published in 1882 called The Authentic Life of Billy the Kid. In other words, the day that celebrated American freedom also included temporary freedom from the laws that applied during the other 364 days of the year. Number 10. On the Old West frontier, cowboys spent months completely isolated. No roads, no telegraph, no mail carrier. They worked on ranches so far away that any news from their families took weeks or months to arrive, if it arrived at all. The 4th of July changed that reality for one practical reason. It was one of the only times of the year when enough people gathered in the same place. Small towns organized celebrations, and general stores and saloons served as makeshift post offices. Letters piled up, waiting for someone to come pick them up. A cowboy might receive 3 or 4 letters at once, and here is the detail Hollywood never showed. These men had no idea what they were going to find in those letters. It could be news that a child had been born, or that a mother had died months earlier. Diaries from the time record that the 4th of July was both a celebration and a time of mourning. While fireworks exploded and whiskey flowed, some men sat quietly reading that they had lost someone, and only found out that day. Number 11, Tombstone, 1882, 7 shootouts on a single 4th of July. Tombstone, Arizona, was already a powder keg. The gunfight at the OK Corral had happened less than a year earlier, and the town was still divided between Earp supporters and the cowboys. Now imagine throwing a national holiday, cheap whiskey, and wounded pride into that mix. The result? 7 separate shootouts in a single day. Cochise County records show that 3 of those confrontations ended in death. The day started out peacefully, with a baseball game in the morning and patriotic speeches. But as the sun climbed higher and the bottles emptied, old rivalries came back to the surface. The local sheriff arrested 11 people that night. The town's medical station ran out of beds, and what was supposed to be a celebration of independence turned into the most violent day of the entire year in Tombstone. The most revealing part is this. No one in town was surprised. In a place where carrying a gun was as common as wearing a hat, the 4th of July only sped up what was already going to happen. Number 12. The 4th of July was the most dangerous day of the year in the Old West. You probably picture Independence Day in the West as fireworks and patriotic parades. There was plenty of that too. But police records from towns like Tombstone, Dodge City, and Deadwood tell a different story. The 4th of July saw more shootouts, stabbings, and violent deaths than any other day on the calendar. Even more than Ranch Payday, which was already notorious for causing trouble. The reason is not hard to understand. It was the only day of the year when everyone came into town at the same time. Cowboys from rival ranches, miners, gamblers, and travelers passing through. Everyone was armed. Everyone had been drinking since early in the day. Old personal grudges flared up again in the middle of the celebration. And the detail that made everything worse, the marshals and deputies were celebrating too. The authorities who were supposed to keep the peace were in the same saloon as everyone else. Records from the 1870s and 1880s show this pattern, repeating year after year in those towns. Number 13. Imagine a horse race with no track, no fence, and no rules at all. That was exactly what happened on the 4th of July in towns like Tombstone, Dodge City, and Deadwood. The course was Main Street itself. The starting line was at one end of the street, and the finish line was at the other. Simple as that. The problem was that no one closed the street. Pedestrians, wagons, dogs, everything stayed right there in the middle of the road while the horses came charging through at full speed. Anyone who did not get out of the way on their own had to deal with the consequences. And those consequences were real. There are records of pedestrians being killed in these races in Tombstone in 1880, Dodge City in 1887, and Deadwood in 1888. 3 different towns, 3 different years, the same result. No one canceled the race the following year. In fact, the danger was part of the attraction. The crowd knew someone could get hurt or killed, and they still packed the sidewalks to watch. It was the most anticipated event of the entire day. Number 14. Texas Cowboys. Refused to celebrate. They were former Confederates. This will change the way you see the Old West. When the Civil War ended in 1865, the South was devastated. Thousands of Confederate soldiers returned home with nothing. Many of these men went to Texas and became cowboys, driving cattle along the trails that led to Kansas. Now think about it. These guys had fought against the Union. They had watched friends die at the hands of the Federal Army. Then the 4th of July came around, and someone expected them to celebrate the nation that had just crushed everything they stood for. For many of them, the answer was simple: no. In several Texas communities, the 4th of July was deliberately ignored. Some places organized what was known as Southern Independence Day as an alternative, and this continued into the 1890s. That division was real and deep, but Hollywood never showed it. In movies, the cowboy is always portrayed as a unified, patriotic American. In real life, the West remained divided between North and South for decades after the war. Number 15. In the 19th century, frontier towns had a custom that seems hard to believe today. On the 4th of July, children were hired to carry gunpowder from storage buildings to the places where militias and marksmen held their celebrations. These boys were called powder monkeys. They were paid between 25 and 50 cents for the entire day, at a time when an adult man took home between $1 and $2. It was good money for a boy, but the risk was real. Medical records from western states document severe burns and even the deaths of children who handled gunpowder during the festivities. These cases became the main argument behind the Safe and Sane 4th of July movement, created in 1903, which pushed for changes in how the holiday was celebrated. Even so, in some isolated Western communities, the practice did not disappear completely until the 1910s. Number 16. Most people think rodeos have always been part of the 4th of July, but the real story is the other way around. In 1869, in a small place called Deer Trail, Colorado, a group of cowboys from neighboring ranches started arguing over who was the best rider. No one would back down. So they decided to settle it the only way that made sense to them, by competing. They organized formal riding contests right there on the 4th of July that year. The Denver Rocky Mountain News covered the event, leaving an official record of what happened. This is the first documented rodeo in American history, and there is one detail that changes everything. Other towns saw the idea and wanted to copy it. But why was it always held on the 4th of July? Simple. It was the only day of the year when cowboys stopped working on the ranches and went into town. It was the only time they could gather enough competitors. In other words, the 4th of July did not adopt the rodeo. It was the other way around. The rodeo was born on that day out of pure practical necessity. Number 17. In 8x, Deadwood was a lawless mining camp in Dakota Territory. That was where James Butler Hickok, Wild Bill, spent his last 4th of July. By then, Hickok was no longer the same fearless gunslinger from the legends. At 39, his eyesight was getting worse, and he knew he had enemies everywhere. During that Independence Day celebration, witnesses said he drank heavily and seemed restless, as if he sensed something was coming. According to a close friend, Hickok supposedly confessed that he did not expect to survive the summer. The disturbing detail is that he was right. Exactly 29 days later, on August 2nd, a man named Jack McCall walked into the Nuttall and Mann Saloon and shot Hickok in the back of the head while he was playing poker. When his body fell onto the table, the cards Wild Bill had been holding were revealed. 2 pairs, aces, and eights. The combination became known forever as the Dead Man's Hand. Number 18. The sheriff used the 4th of July to arrest wanted men. Throughout the year, the sheriff of a frontier county had a serious problem. His territory covered hundreds of square miles of isolated ranches, trails, and scattered camps. Going after a wanted man meant days on horseback with no guarantee of finding him. Many criminals knew this and simply stayed away from town for months. But the 4th of July changed everything. The holiday worked like a magnet. Practically every man in the county showed up in town to drink, watch races, and take part in the festivities. County records from Kansas show that serving warrants and collecting debts peaked on the days surrounding the holiday. The sheriff no longer had to hunt anyone down. All he had to do was wait. The cattle thief who had run off in March, the man with an outstanding warrant since winter, they all came into town on their own, looking for whiskey and entertainment. Several wanted criminals were captured exactly this way, in the middle of fireworks and crowds celebrating independence. Number 19. Women spent the entire 4th of July cooking. Here is a detail no one puts in the movies. In 19th century frontier communities, the 4th of July had 2 very different sides. For men, it was a day of competition, drinking, and target shooting. For women, it was a day of hard work from beginning to end. The so-called 4th of July dinner was a community event that did not come together on its own. Someone had to put all that food on the table, and that someone was the women. The preparation started days in advance. Pies, bread, roasted meat, everything made from scratch without any of the conveniences we have today. At the same time, they still had to take care of the children. When the celebration finally happened, most of them spent hours serving food and then cleaning everything up, while their husbands were already passed out drunk on the floor. Women's diaries from that time show this side of the story without sugarcoating it. A typical entry says something like, "There is nothing festive about a day when you cook for 12 hours and then wash everything by yourself." This side of the celebration simply never appeared in Hollywood. Number 20. Before fireworks reached the American West, People celebrated the 4th of July with whatever they had on hand. And one thing mining towns had plenty of was dynamite. In the 1870s and 1880s, communities in Colorado and Nevada had huge stockpiles of explosives used to blast tunnels through the mountains. When the holiday came around, miners took those same charges and set them off in town squares and streets as if they were fireworks. The problem is obvious. Dynamite was not made for celebrations. Medical records from that time show that deaths and serious injuries caused by improvised explosives were common at these festivities. One of the best documented cases happened in Silver City, Nevada, on the 4th of July in 1879. An explosion killed 4 people and injured 16 others. The local doctor who treated the victims described the scene as a battlefield. For many people in the Old West, celebrating independence literally meant risking their lives. Number 21. The 4th of July was the most expensive day of the year for the average cowboy. An ordinary cowboy in the 1880s made somewhere between $25 and $40 a month. That sounds like very little, and it was. But the real problem started when the 4th of July came around. In that one day, a man could spend everything he had and still end up in debt. Here's how it worked. The cowboy spent weeks isolated out on the range, barely spending any money. When he came into town for the holiday, that money was burning a hole in his pocket. Saloon owners knew this and raised drink prices specifically for that day. There was also betting on horse races, shooting contests with entry fees, restaurant food he never ate during the rest of the year, and at the end of the night, a fine for disorderly conduct. Employer records show that August was consistently the hardest month on ranches because cowboys came back broke and in debt to the saloon itself. The holiday that celebrated the nation's independence was the very day the cowboy lost his own. Number 22. Here is a detail few people know. In frontier towns, the 4th of July killed people in a way no one expected. It was not bullets, it was not fireworks, it was horses. The noise from the celebrations drove the animals completely out of control. Gunshots fired into the air, gunpowder explosions, crowds shouting. All of it happening at once created a wall of terrifying noise for horses tied to posts along the streets. The animals broke free from their ropes and bolted through the crowds. Records from several towns show pedestrians being killed by panicked horses, not by gun-related accidents. The problem became so serious that some local governments passed specific laws requiring all horses to be locked inside stables during the afternoon festivities. Think about that. The animal that supported every part of life on the frontier, used for work, transportation, and survival, became a deadly threat on the most patriotic day of the year. It was a real danger that people at the time knew very well. Number 23. The Declaration of Independence was read aloud in the town square, and the crowd drank during the reading. In small towns across the American West, there was a custom that almost no one knows about today. On the 4th of July, the mayor or local judge would step onto a makeshift platform in the town square and read the entire Declaration of Independence from beginning to end. The reading took between 10 and 15 minutes, and the people listened to every word with genuine respect. Those frontier communities had a strong sense of patriotism, built through isolation and the hardships of everyday life. But here is the detail that records from the time do not hide. While they listened, people drank non-stop. Whiskey, cider, whatever was available. And whenever the document reached a particularly powerful passage, the crowd responded with applause, shouting, and gunshots fired into the air. The further the reading went, the more excited the audience became. The result was a mix of sincere patriotism and complete lack of restraint that probably created the loudest and most emotional crowd in American history. Number 24. The Frontier, 4th of July, did not end because of a law. It ended because the frontier itself disappeared. No one signed a decree banning the wild celebrations of the Old West. What happened was simpler and more inevitable. The 1890 census officially declared that the American frontier no longer existed. There was no longer a dividing line between settled territory and the unknown. And without a frontier, there was no way to preserve traditions that depended on it. Towns grew, railroads connected communities that had once been isolated for weeks. Law enforcement became properly organized, and the population increased. Everything that defined the frontier 4th of July, gunshots fired into the air, unstructured celebrations, armed civilians deciding how to celebrate, simply no longer fit into the world that was taking shape. No one banned it. Urban life slowly swallowed that way of celebrating until it disappeared. And here is the detail few people realize. That wild 4th of July that Hollywood turned into a myth lasted only about 30 years in practice. 3 decades. It was real, but it existed for far less time than we imagine. Number 25. Deadwood had the bloodiest 4th of July in the West in '86, and no one knows about it. In '86, Deadwood was nothing more than a camp made up of tents in Dakota Territory. The place had sprung up just months earlier, when gold was discovered in the Black Hills. Thousands of men rushed there looking for fortune, but there was no law at all. None. No sheriff, no judge, no jail. When the 4th of July arrived that year, Deadwood was packed with miners, gamblers, and people running from trouble in other states. The combination of cheap whiskey, loaded guns, and no authority turned the celebration into a bloodbath. Knife fights, shootouts, and personal scores being settled happened one after another throughout that week. Bodies showed up in the alleys in the morning, and no one investigated anything. This pattern of violence became the town's trademark, and it did not take long for things to get even worse. Less than a month after that 4th of July, Wild Bill Hickok sat down to play poker at Saloon number 10 and was shot in the back of the head. Deadwood was already used to death before he arrived.